Okay, we should be all set to go. I have started recording, so we should be good. And I'm going to have you on active speaker view for this. And you feel good with the content sharing and everything?
I'm a little shaky, but I think I can do it. Yeah.
Okay, great. If there are any problems, I can absolutely help with the privileges that I have on host setting. So
Yeah.
let me we'll be good.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I've done some sharing, but I mean, what I was hoping to do tonight was use the slideshow option on the
Yeah.
PowerPoint to cover the entire screen, which I don't usually do, but I think that should work.
All right. Perfect. Yeah, that sounds good. We've had a few presenters do that, so should be smooth sailing.
Okay. So are you going to introduce me or
Yeah, I can absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I could introduce myself, I suppose, too, but I'm just
I,
wondering.
yeah, I usually when we have these presentations, the honors presents um, ambassador, I guess, or coordinator will read the land grant, and then we'll like kind of just go right into it. Land grant or not land grant, the land acknowledgement, sorry. And then speaker usually takes it away. But if you would like me to read your Cats Connect bio, I can absolutely do that.
No, I mean, I just, typically when you have a speaker, you say something that convinces the audience that they're not just the first guy that you pulled off the street. You know,
Very true. Very true.
you certainly don't have to read my bio. That's probably excessive.
Yes, I what we do, we introduce what the event is, but we don't give like a comprehensive speaker bio most of the time.
Yeah, and that would be fine too.
Okay, okay, perfect.
All right.
Hello, everybody joining. We're going to be starting at 6 o'clock. So thank you for here. And yeah, please, you guys are muted, which is great. And feel free to turn on your cameras if you want. We're just going to be on presenter view. Okay. Hello, everybody joining. We're going to be starting in a few minutes here. Thank you so much for being here today. Right. Definitely got people coming in now. Hello, everybody who's in. Feel free to turn on your cameras if you want. We're going to be on presenter view for recording this presentation, so you will not be videotaped with your face. But feel free at any point in the presentation to ask questions in the chat, and we're going to answer those at the end. But yes, thank you for keeping your mics off during the presentation.
So I have a question, Kate.
Yeah.
Is this a presentation that's open to all honor students, or is it
Yes.
it's to all? Okay.
Yeah, it is to all. The Honors 201 students are the only ones who receive credit for attending these presentations, but it's open actually, in fact, to the whole community, as long as they get the Cats Connect link.
Mm-hmm.
It was pretty interesting too. We were able with a few weeks ago we had a presentation with Deidre Combs, and she's more of a she used to teach at MSU, but she does these Friday morning presentations with her own global group. And so we actually just pretty much partnered with her for that presentation. So we did it on Zoom because we couldn't do MSU Webex, and it was like 35 different countries were there. It was pretty crazy.
Wow.
Hey, Atticus. Dr. Flory, this is who I told you about.
Okay.
Atticus, I told him that you're thrilled that he's going to be going over Zootopia. Thank you,
Oops, I'm unmuted. Yes, I really, really like Zootopia. That's one of my favorite movies.
Yeah. Well, I'll be both critical and praiseworthy of it.
That's fair. All good.
Hello to everybody joining. Thank you for having your mics off for this presentation. Feel free to turn your cameras on if you want. It's going to be on presenter view for this recording, so you will not be seen unless you're talking, so remember to keep your mics off. Feel free to enter questions in the chat, and we will answer those at the end, and we're going to be starting in just a few minutes here. Dr. Flory, how are your classes going with COVID?
I'm teaching remotely, and they're going okay, but it's a challenge, I think, for a lot of students to stay engaged.
Yeah.
And I'm doing it asynchronously because I thought, given how complicated it is to get students to meet online in quiet places and so on, I thought, well, okay, we'll do it this way.
That's smart.
Yeah, and the students who participate actively are doing fine. I worry about the ones who are kind of, I feared, getting lost a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. But as a student, I do appreciate the asynchronous aspect because it's nice to have a mix, and I'm sure most people do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a common kind of thing right now.
Right. Which classes are you teaching this semester?
I'm doing ancient and medieval Western philosophy and philosophy and race. So
okay, yeah. Those are neat. I'm taking a Western Civ class right now, so that interests me for sure.
Mm-hmm. Is this with Susan Cohen?
Yeah, it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. During regular semesters that she's teaching that, I've done a presentation for her, but
Oh, neat.
I didn't this time. I'm I'm in one of those at-risk categories for a number of reasons. So
I understand. What do you usually, within the semester, when do you usually give the guest presentation?
Early on, because it's about the idea of Western civilization.
Oh, yeah.
And, it's weird. I mean, it's a concept that's only been used for about 100 years or so. And it came into use for a number of really kind of weird reasons. So I talk about those and try to offer a criticism of, why we still have Western Civ courses when it seems like what we really have to do is have world civilization courses.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, she definitely synthesized that on the first day. So that point was not lost.
Okay, well, that's good.
Yeah. Hello, everybody joining. We are going to start in just a minute here. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and get started on the introductions just because they're going to take a minute. This is an Honors Presents event, which is hosted by the Honors College. We are the Honors Presents lecture series. If this is your first presentation, welcome. This is obviously special this semester with COVID, but virtual presentations are going pretty well, and I thank you in advance for keeping your microphones off. And if you want to turn on your videos, feel free to do so. We do record these presentations, so it is only on presenter view, so you will not be videotaped, but that is on the condition that you are not speaking, because then it will switch to you. So please make sure that you are muted for the duration of this presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to type those out in the chat. And then we are going to address those at the end. But yeah, thank you for being here today. And I'm going to go ahead and read the land acknowledgement. So we begin by acknowledging with honor and respect the indigenous nations on whose traditional territories the university now stands, and whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. We also acknowledge the elders, past and present, including MSU's current council of elders, and humbly ask for their guidance. The Valley of the Flowers has been and remains a place of learning for Native American peoples who for millennia have passed ways of knowing, being, and doing from one generation to the next. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it is an important social justice and decolonial practice that promotes Indigenous visibility and a reminder that we are on settled Indigenous land. So today we are here to listen to Dr. Dan Flory present on the Disney movie Zootopia and audience implicit racial bias and cinematic twists in that film. Dr. Dan Flory is a professor of philosophy at MSU, and he teaches a couple classes here. If you were here in the beginning, you heard him talking about his 2 classes for this semester. And he is a fantastic expert on this area. And so I'm excited to hear him speak about Zootopia, and I thank you all for being here. So Dr. Dan Flory, take it away.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Kate. Let me see if I can bring this up and make it work. Okay, so let me hit share. See if I can make this work. And I was hoping, let's see, do slideshow. Okay, all right. So, as Kate noted, tonight's presentation is on Zootopia. It has to do with audience and who I think the film is addressing, implicit racial bias, and different kinds of twists that the film offers us. Now, Zootopia is a work of mass art, okay? And that is to say, it's designated to provide a general meaning without special tutoring or in-depth contemplation. Mass audiences, in general, can understand and appreciate immediately and nearly effortlessly whatever the film offers. And that's just a very broad general definition of mass art that I'm offering you here. Let's see. Now, as a piece of mass art, it's also important to remember that it can be offered not only to general mass audiences, but also specific audiences. And that's what this film, like lots of Disney films, do. Their primary target audience is children and their parents, okay? And this is something that has been noted by many people. But in addition, Disney movies have specifically come into kind of critical analysis because a number of critics have argued that these films are presented to primarily white children and their parents, okay? And so I quickly kind of noted Hurley and Giroux and Pollack and Sarita Gregory as examples of scholars who offer this criticism of Disney films. Now, the audience targeting is not necessarily something that's intentional. It could, of course, be a kind of non-conscious implicit bias on the part of the film artists. But more generally, you know, there's often been criticisms offered by people like Richard Dyer and others that Hollywood cinema often has a kind of bias toward whites in its presentation of its lectures. No, or sorry, its presentation of its films. So Zootopia offers us a chance to try to investigate not only a fairly specific question having to do with Disney movies, but also with a more specific one about Hollywood cinema. So it's important to note, I think, that this film actually takes on implicit racial bias explicitly in the form of a children's movie. And that's a thing that I'll try to explain and then sort of elaborate on over the course of this lecture. Zootopia is something that I think looks at this subconscious or unconscious imposition of negative and false stereotypes on others as a kind of intentional sort of act on the part of the filmmakers. And in that way, it is meant to counteract a lot of the past films that Disney has offered, which by no means do that sort of thing. This seems relevant, especially now in the wake of, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement and recent protests about police killings of unarmed Black men in the US. And I think Zootopia offers us a number of surprisingly thoughtful ways to consider these kinds of issues. Now, the metaphor, I mean, the thing to note about Zootopia is that it is a kind of metaphorical vehicle for confronting racial bias. And the way it does that is it uses fear on the part of prey animals for predators, okay? This is something that makes Zootopia something that offers a social critique. And this is something that, of course, the co-directors explicitly aim to do. They said that they meant to explore bias. Both Byron Howard and Richard Moore noted that, and that they were seeking to convey the insight that, to quote Rich Moore, even the most good-natured person can be susceptible to putting stereotypes on another person. Now, the way they do this is through their good girl police officer bunny protagonist, Judy Hopps. Now, Moore and Howard both cite that there are antecedents here, right? For making social criticisms about people, about society, by means of clothing and making human-like animal characters. And even Disney movies have done this in the past. So I've given you little images from Robin Hood and The Wind in the Willows, both of which do this sort of social criticism by means of these anthropomorphized animal characters. Now, in Zootopia, they begin immediately, because what you get in the first sounds, for example, are kettle drum rolls and a predatory animal roar. And the first words that are spoken are Judy telling us, fear, treachery, bloodlust. Thousands of years ago, these were the forces that ruled our world, a world where prey were scared of predators, and predators had an uncontrollable biological urge to maim and maul and kill. So the world, according to Zootopia, a long time ago, was made up of meek prey and vicious predators. And of course, now the people, or the creatures in this story world have evolved beyond these, as Judy says, primitive savage ways, end quote. Now, these elements of the movie are really part of a play that Judy is putting on with her friends for a talent show at a time when she's a child. But what you get presented with by means of this skit that they're doing is this idea of predatory instincts being in the biology of predators and fear in the prey, on the part of prey. Now, these themes are further reinforced by means of the instinctual fear that Judy shows for foxes in the form of the class bully Gideon Gray. And I thought it would be useful to give you an image of that. Here you can see that Judy seems to show a kind of instinctual fear for foxes in the form of the class bully here. Okay, now these early sequences take advantage of what film studies scholar David Bordwell calls the primacy effect. This is the effect that filmmakers can utilize but in order to raise viewer expectations by means of opening sequences. And Zootopia does this by encouraging its audience to anticipate that the issue of predator-prey relations and the presumptions that go with them will be of telling significance in the story that follows. Now, in particular, the fear manifested prey for predators will come to play an important role in this film. Now, jumping ahead 15 years in the story world, we see Judy here depicted on the left being seen off on a train to go to Zootopia by her parents, who are on the right here. Now, the important thing about this scene is that as Judy is about to depart for Zootopia, her parents express fear, and they actually explicitly say terror, at Judy moving to the big city because it's full of predators. And these predators are coded as urban, okay? That is to say, they're coded as raced and to be feared. Judy's mother says, for example, that, the worst thing of all for these bunny characters is that the city is full of foxes. She says it's in their biology. And by that, she means that, Judy's going to face characters who are treacherous and savage. Now, Judy's mother gives this warning and implies through it that predator, treachery, and savagery are hardwired, into these characters and therefore unchangeable. Now, in line with this, or consistent with this, Judy's father then offers his daughter going away gifts of fox deterrent, fox repellent, and fox taser that I find hilariously powerful. Now, in order to make her parents stop worrying, Judy takes the fox repellent with her for the trip into the Zootopia. And she also takes it with her for her first day on the job as a police officer later in the film. But first, I couldn't resist giving you an image of the fox taser that Judy's father offers to her. It's, well, anyway, I guess the images are self-explanatory there. And Judy doesn't take that one, but she does take this fox repellent. Now, the movie regularly reminds its audience of its stereotyping theme, okay? And it does it by means of the various character that Judy meets over the course of being introduced to police work and going into the police station. And I thought I'd give you a couple of examples by means of images on the next slides. So she meets Clawhauser, who is a flabby, donut-loving cop who's also a leopard, who you can see here on the right. She also meets a rhinoceros police officer who she offers to fist bump in an agreement that they really are trying to make the world a better place. And he wearily does so, and kind of consistently with this idea of rhinoceros as being kind of slow and very powerful. Now, one of the things to note about this film is there are two realistic heuristics at work, one for humans and one for animals. Now, a realistic heuristic is a belief or idea that we import from what we believe about the actual world and how it works in order to fill in the gaps in storytelling and make sense of what is on screen in the film. And this is an idea that Noel Carroll has developed, but I borrow it here to help us understand how it is that Zootopia works. There are these two realistic heuristics at work. We can use one or the other depending on which one the film guides us to use. And Zootopia regularly reminds us of its play with these two different realistic heuristics as the narrative proceeds, because it uses them to amusingly either confirm or contradict them. Okay. And I think this is a crucial thing because there's a confusion about realistic heuristics that'll become important later in the narrative. So as we follow Judy through the film, we get the example of going to the Department of Mammal Vehicles and finding that it's entirely staffed by swaths. And I mean, I'm probably old enough to be the grandfather of most of you, okay? And my experience over my lifetime is that DMVs are perhaps not staffed by literal sloths, but by people who metaphorically are well represented by sloths. So that's a kind of amusing confirmation of a stereotype. Now, another one that actually contradicts the stereotype is Judy meets Nangi, who is an elephant who always forgets, who remembers nothing. And by contrast, Judy also meets Yax, who is a stoned character who remembers everything down to the very finest of details. And he's the last person you would expect to actually remember that finely. Now, the idea of negative bias against predators seriously re-enters the narrative when Judy encounters Nick. Now, Judy immediately suspects that Nick is up to no good based on her predisposition to see foxes as untrustworthy. And Zootopia plays with our expectations here because we first see that Nick appears to be a kind and devoted father. And then we find out later that he's actually running an elaborate and clever scam. And he is a kind of hustler, as he calls himself. Now, the latter turns out to confirm Judy's negative biases about foxes. And then when she confronts him, as you can see in this little picture down at the bottom right, Nick then confirms by means of a cynical lecture about what we can be as opposed to what we are, that further kind of highlights this stereotyping theme. Now, in terms of implicit biases, it makes sense for us to note that Nick has given in to what psychologist Claude Steele has called stereotype threat. And this is a widely confirmed psychological phenomenon whereby individuals feel themselves to be at risk of conforming to negative stereotypes about their social group. Nick has actually embraced being seen primarily as an untrustworthy and treacherous fox, which is to say, he's made it a part of his identity and how he sees himself. Judy, on the other hand, worries that she's going to be giving in to the negative stereotype of being a fearful and dumb bunny. Now, to develop a little bit further here, I have to fill in some plot details, so let me do that briefly. It comes to pass that Judy and Nick have to partner up in order to solve a major case facing the Zootopia Police Department. This is the missing mammals case, in which 15 mammals have recently gone missing, and no one can find them or figure out what's happened. So Judy becomes involved and coerces Nick into helping her. They discover that the missing animals have been, quote, gone savage, end quote, and are locked away in an old hospital, which is guarded by timber wolves who can't resist howling at virtually every chance that they get. Here's Mr. Manches, who's one of the predators who's inexplicably gone savage here. Now, by means of this quest that they end up going on, Nick and Judy warm up to each other. We find out by Nick's explanation to Judy how he gave into stereotype threat. Nick also develops and blossoms as a character, and he goes from being a low-level wheeler-dealer exploiting the margins of the law to being someone who we, as well as Nick as himself, could see as upholding the law as well. And there's a certain kind of character development that takes place for Nick. Now, at this point, this is roughly 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the film, there comes a press conference. And Judy, as the prime arresting officer, becomes a representative, and she is asked to explain why some of the city's residents have regressed to a state from which it was assumed that they had evolved long ago. Now, in order to answer this question, Judy reaches back to ideas learned in her childhood and speculates that it may be due to their alleged, quote, biology, end quote. She explains that some of the city's residents have gone savage due to their predator, quote, biology, a biological component, something in their DNA, end quote. And then Judy goes on and says, thousands of years ago, predators survived through these aggressive hunting instincts, and now they seem to be reverting back to their primitive savage ways. Now, one of the things that's quite important about this news conference is, first of all, this underscoring by Judy about these alleged predator instincts, this biology that they're alleged to have, okay? The other thing that's important about the press conference is the movie then switches to Nick's point of view as he listens to Judy denigrate predators. Now, as he listens, he comes to identify with the predators who've gone savage, and then he eventually becomes angry at the accusation that due to these allegedly unchangeable traits coded into their DNA, that all predators could potentially become threats to the public. Now, after the press conference, he questions Judy about her presumption regarding predators. And to this questioning, she smugly responds that she's just stating facts. And she notes that, predators are biologically predisposed to be savage and bunnies are not. So you get this little image here with the words kind of overlaying on that. It's not like a bunny could go savage. She also others predators by using the term them in order to identify these animals who are actually fellow citizens of Zootopia. Now, Nick responds to these alleged explanations by saying he's no different from the other predators, in spite of G's claim that he's not, quote, that kind of predator, end quote. Nick notes in response he's no different from the other predators, implying that there's no way to distinguish between good and bad ones. He becomes increasingly agitated and asks Judy whether she's afraid of him and whether she thinks he might go nuts and suddenly eat her. And she then reflexively responds by reaching for her fox repellent. And to illustrate this, I thought I'd give you a couple of images from this scene after the press conference. So at first, he's talking to her with a certain amount of anger. He gestures as if he were to threaten her. And Judy reflexively reaches for her fox spray that's on her hip. So you get these imagistic depictions of what's going on. Now, what this signifies is the following. It signifies that there's been an epistemological twist, which is to say, there's a seemingly unremarkable, apparently empirical claim about predators that viewers have generally presumed to be true within the story world, and it's turned out instead that it's actually an analog for an implicit racial bias. Now, this is what philosopher George Wilson has called an epistemological twist. And in Zootopia, it's the change from the belief that predators in this fiction have an uncontrollable biological urge to maim and maul and kill, as in the first scene mentioned, to the idea that it's actually an implicit bias about predator characters. This is a kind of twist which involves, in fact, requires a complete sort of restructuring of the narrative epistemologically, which is why George Wilson termed it an epistemological twist. Now, an epistemological twist, to give you a definition, is an unexpected revelatory narrative turn that reveals unanticipated complexities in a narrative or a character. And here I've given you a kind of reference to Wilson's essay where he first described this. So in Zootopia, you have a presumption about predatory characters, predatory animals, which is that they are biologically or instinctually potentially violent. And suddenly it's revealed to be a presumption about human-like characters, which corresponds to implicit racial bias. So what we have here is a turn from using the animal heuristic to interpret this belief, which is a plausible kind of interpretation given what we've seen in the film, and twisting that so that we realize that we should have been using a human heuristic to understand it all along. So this twist, which requires the subsequent switch between heuristics, functions by means of audience members' misconstrual of various sociopolitically inflected elements in the story that then are radically turned on their heads, so to speak. And that strongly encourages viewers to then substantively reimagine the story's meaning. And this task places for us reformulating what we've been watching in the story as it's progressed. So this belief that predatorship is biological, okay, turns out to be a kind of negative prejudice against predator creatures in the story. And in that way, it's a kind of direct analog to implicit racial bias. It becomes a kind of metaphor for race because it's an idea about a particular group of fellow creatures and their alleged biological predisposition to go savage. And the status of that belief changes over the course of the narrative. And moreover, it's underscored by Judy beginning to see the story world according to this switch in epistemological perspective, which then encourages us to do so as well. So we see this, perhaps, for example, in Judy siding with the peacefully protesting leopard on the right, holding a protest sign, rather than this epithet-spewing pig who gets the facts wrong about where leopards come from. We see it perhaps more kind of crystallinely when Judy's on the subway and she sees fear being taught to a child bunny by her mother when an unthreatening lion sits next to her on the subway bench. And again, what we're seeing is a kind of change from using the animal heuristic to using the human realistic heuristic in order to fill in aspects of the story. Okay. Now, this is something that I think in particular most white viewers do. They initially imagine the predators as biologically predisposed to be savage by means of the animal realistic heuristic. However, its real epistemic status is then revealed in the scene after the press conference as being determined instead by means of the human realistic heuristic. So its real epistemic status is not initially transparent in terms of the narrative, but that is a characteristic of epistemological twists, that there's something that you're offered that you're initially not given clear indication of its status. You assume that it's going to be one way, and it actually turns out to be another. So to go to this idea of implicit bias, Michael Brownstein says that roughly speaking, implicit biases are evaluative thoughts and feelings about social groups that can contribute to discriminatory behavior even in the absence of explicitly prejudiced motivations. Now, racialized versions of implicit biases can be forms of embodied social cognition that involve non-conscious and automatized attitudes, assessments, and social behaviors that are racially prejudices. So automatic reactions that turn out to have a kind of racial bias, even though we may hold ourselves no explicitly prejudiced kind of beliefs that motivate those particular reactions. Now, the epistemological twist in Zootopia is one that draws that draws on this kind of commonality between predator prejudice and implicit racial bias. And this is something, as I've already noted, was intentional on the part of the filmmakers. They want their audience to understand and attend to and think about the ways in which people can put together negative stereotypes and place them on other people in spite of having the best of intentions. And so Judy is the kind of embodiment of that kind of sentiment. And she comes to realize it, and that becomes very clear in the narrative, and then tries to make amends. And this, of course, implicitly urges viewers to reflect on these kinds of things themselves. Now, there's something else that's revealed by Judy's realization, and I would argue that it's that white children and their parents are the primary target audiences that this film is designed to reach. So one of the things that we should note that Howard and Moore do not, okay, is that the bias they depict and aim to criticize in Zootopia is one that most predominantly resides in white viewers. And so this film retains a kind of old Disney presumption that some of the critics I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture identified. It's that the primary target audience for Disney films, Zootopia in particular, will be a white one, racially white one. And in particular, the kind of white middle-class children and their parents as target audience, which is what Pollard and Gregory and Giroux and Pollard and various other people. Sorry, I got that wrong. It's anyway. These critics have argued that, and I've noted their work earlier. Okay, now to turn to philosopher Shannon Sullivan, who has written quite a bit about critical race theory. She says in her book, Good White People, that critical philosophers of race need to explore, and here I have to look at my thing. Critical philosophers of race need to explore how different white habits might be cultivated in the first place. And this means turning their attention to white children. And so the problem that Sullivan identifies as a problem for critical philosophy of race is that the perspective that white children are usually taught, namely racial colorblindness, is a position that fails to produce a world that is post-racial because it enables ongoing racial injustices to persist and grow and fester. And so racial colorblindness, which is what white children are typically taught, given them habits of perception and thinking and conception that allow them to systematically overlook and or ignore many existing problems of race. Now, these habits concerning race that white children learn fit under this category that philosopher Charles Mills has offered us, which is the epistemology of ignorance. And what I'm arguing is that this is one of the ways children are trained to have flawed and race-blind habits through Hollywood cinema. Now, Disney movies in particular have this sort of, have a long kind of sordid history using racial stereotypes, whether they're Orientalist or blackface or Native American stereotypes. And so there's this long kind of heritage from Dumbo and Fantasia and Lady and the Tramp and Song of the South and Peter Pan and the Jungle Book and the Aristocats, where you find racial stereotypes time and time and time again in these movies offered for children. Now, one of the things that means is that in general, Disney that has a main target audience of white middle-class children in America. They're the ones who are going to buy the tickets, buy the DVDs. I guess not anymore, but they used to buy DVDs of these things. Stream these movies on Disney Plus, things like that. And clearly, Zootopia is trying to break free from that past, okay? And to a degree, I think it does do that. But to a degree, Zootopia also does not fully break free from that past kind of racial bias that Disney has in its children's films. So, I'm sorry, to kind of further underscore this, I want to talk about thematic twists for a moment. So I've mentioned what an epistemological twist is and tried to describe how that's racial in Zootopia. Now I want to briefly say something about a thematic twist. Now, thematic twists are content-based, and epistemological twists are typically motivated stylistically by means of different kind of shots and things hidden from the audience, okay, and then eventually revealed through the epistemological twist. Now, the thematic twist in Zootopia that I think the thematic twist in Zootopia that I think is important here and that intertwines with the epistemological twist is that Judy comes to be revealed as what I've described as a sympathetic racist character. And one of the things that means is that Judy is something like the character Sal in Do the Right Thing. Namely, she's a character with whom white viewers come to very closely engage, both sympathetically as well as empathetically. And yet hidden within her character, we find the story world analog to an implicit racial bias. Now, in addition, Judy also curries white viewers' racial allegiance, which is kind of like their sort of readiness to ally with her as a character in a film based on a racial commonality. Now, this is conveyed by means of the voice used to characterize her, which is, Jennifer Goodwin's voice, the kind of cultural markers that surround her, and her general demeanor, which I think all kind of signify racial whiteness. Now, what this gives us is the presumption that Judy is, metaphorically speaking, racially white. And it's reinforced by all kinds of particularities surrounding Judy, like her small town rural upbringing, her parents, and other kind of signifiers that are associated with her through the movie. Now, film theorist Richard Dyer published a book 23 years ago called White. And in that book, he claimed that racial whiteness typically serves as the presumptive human universal in Hollywood movies. And I would argue this is something that's true in Disney films as well. And it also underscores something that I think makes this movie much more powerful for white audiences. Okay. The film thematically twists, if you will, from being about a plucky sort of female character fighting against implicit gender biases to being a film about that same character having implicit racial biases herself. And that's what I would identify as Zootopia's thematic twist, which kind of pairs with the epistemological twist that I described earlier. And it significantly complicates Judy as a character for us because she is both sympathetic and in some ways she acts in racially biased ways. For shorthand, I would say she's a sympathetic racist character. By no means as bad as Sal in Do the Right Thing, but nonetheless, I think she fits broadly into that category. Okay, so one of the things that is worth visiting just for a moment, I think, is, okay, what could non-white children and their parents come to appreciate or learn from a movie like Zootopia? Okay, now they might see it as a kind of cautionary tale about how many whites fail to see race as a problem, or at least they don't see it until it's, very, very obvious to them and in their face. And that kind of blindness can affect even symbolic good white people like Judy. Okay. They also might see Zootopia as presenting a kind of flawed way to resolve implicit racial bias, because what the film offers at its conclusion is a kind of deeply individualistic way to resolve implicit racial biases without in any way hinting at the possibility that there might be systemic or ongoing structural forms of racism. And so the bias, by means of the way the film presents how to resolve it and address it, seems to be a kind of very individualistic thing. It starts with you, it starts with me, it starts with all of us, but it doesn't seem to be a part of systems that might need to be remedied or kind of reformulated. And so bias is something that is not seen as ingrained in social systems. And you don't see any depictions of structural racism in Zootopia. You don't hear it in the language that the Zootopians speak by and large. You do hear, by contrast, structural sexism in the way that Judy sometimes referenced. She's called things like Bummy Bumpkin and Flopsy the Copsy and other kinds of derogatory kind of terms that point to a kind of sexism against her. But you don't really have a corresponding set of terms that arise to signify the way in which predator prejudice would be like implicit racial bias. So the resolution for racism that Zootopia offers is entirely dependent on individuals and their elimination of their own biases, not systemic transformations. And so that I would argue is a kind of shortcoming of the film. So existing power structures aren't addressed. For example, the police force isn't seen as a problematic source for implicit biases in the way that it is in the real world oftentimes. And I'll just add one reason I'm describing these things is that all these things point up to the way in which non-white children and their parents probably aren't going to be affected by these epistemological and thematic twists. They might see what's going on in the narrative as further developments, but they wouldn't experience them as twists in the way that white audiences would. And in that sense, it becomes a less powerful film, I think, for non-white audiences and their parents, as opposed to white children and their parents, who are going to experience, I think, if they understand what's going on in Zootopia, much more strongly. Okay, so just to further underscore a couple of these things, one of the things to note about what non-white children and their parents would probably pick up from Zootopia is that the two main leads, voiced by Jennifer Goodwin and Jason Bateman, they have white-sounding voices. I mean, this is like Sorry to Bother You, right? Where you get a white voice to characterize character, and that might have a kind of subtle distancing effect that was not intended by the filmmakers on non-white children and parents viewing the film. Now, one question that arises is, did the filmmakers intentionally aim to primarily target white audience members by making Zootopia in order to get them to think about their possible implicit racial biases? I think it's possible. I actually think it's pretty likely, okay? But the fact remains that Zootopia still sidelines and kind of undervalues and overlooks or distances a good number of its viewers by primarily addressing that white audience of viewers. And in that way, it continues a kind of tradition of Disney as well as Hollywood cinema that it would have done better to have abandoned. So just to conclude here, I think Zootopia is a positive step forward in addressing, pressing problems of race in the form of a children's film. However, it prioritizes white audience members over non-white viewers, and it offers too individualistic a solution to problems of race and ignores structural changes that would be required if this film were in some way representing something more like the real world itself. It's also arguably a little too forgiving of whites. As Judy says, we all make mistakes, as if racism were as forgivable as missing someone's birthday or accidentally stepping on their toes or something. And this forgiving attitude lets whites off the hook, I think, a little too easily regarding problems of race. Now, a logical question to ask at this point is this assessment asking too much of a children's film or an animated feature? I would argue no. And to kind of support that, I want to refer to Shannon Sullivan again. She says, adults' racial habits, including those that function unconsciously, have their beginnings in childhood. Thus, Disney movies like Zootopia are where many problems, as well as potential solutions, would arise. And so we should pay close attention to these films, especially as individuals interested in problems of race and how film might address them. So to, note Shannon Sullivan, again, she says, there's a need to create a critically raced home space that is allied with people of color struggles for racial justice. And that critically raced home space thus needs to include movies and other moving images that do an even better job at addressing problems of race than Zootopia does. And so, of course, does Hollywood cinema more generally. So, thank you for attending this lecture here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flory. We have a few questions in the chat that I would like to read. And everybody, if you could stay for a few more minutes, we're going to go over these questions, and then I will post the link in the chat for the attendance that you will need to click on to get credit for this event. So Dr. Flory, Barla asked, how do you think we can make the racial tensions in the US better, and are films like Zootopia a step forward?
Well, I think Zootopia is a step forward. To address problems of race, there's a million things that need to be done, okay? And honestly, as a philosopher, as philosophers in general, we're really good at diagnosing problems, and we can suggest sort of overall conceptual schemas to kind of revision that sort of thing. And honestly, that's what films can do too. They can get us to revision, kind of rethink how it is that we look at race. And Zootopia takes this step forward in a way, but it also fails to kind of leave aside that its typical audience member is going to be white, racially speaking. And that's a kind of drawback of the film. In order to kind of improve, you'd want to make films that address everybody, right? Okay, how exactly do you do that? Well, I don't have something that's going to fit on a bumper sticker that is going to tell you how to do that. But it is going to take a kind of reconceptualization of the kinds of assumptions that you make about your audience members. And that is something that will be essential to making films that would fit into this kind of racially aware home space that Shannon Sullivan talks about. And in many ways, we're still kind of stumbling our way toward that. But my sense is, okay, philosophy has a role in that kind of clarifying concepts and kind of bringing things to our attention that we might otherwise overlook. But film can do those same things as well. And that's one of the things I find fascinating about film.
Thank you so much. This next question, I think you asked, but if you to expand on it, do you think that Judy's character in the context of the film is also commentary on gender bias?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's no question that this film is about gender bias as well as racial bias. And I mean, it's one of the appeals of the film, right? That you go through the first 2/3 or 3/4 of it, and you think it's about this story of a female character who's overcoming various kinds of biases against her. And then there's this like drop the floor out from under you moment where you realize what it's really about, or at least in part what it's about, is how even a character like that can have racial biases as well. And I mean, I remember watching this with my daughter, who is probably the age of most of you. She's 18, or at least the age of some of you. And I felt like the floor dropped out from under me because I just thought it was a Disney film she dragged me to, right? And okay, it's got a female character and she's kind of fighting her way to kind of be seen as a full human being rather than through stereotypes. And then there's this moment where it's revealed that she has these racial biases. And I thought, wow, this film has done something amazing. And then as I thought about it some more over time, I thought, well, it does do this amazing thing, but it also doesn't do, a few other things. And I've tried to cover that in what I described tonight. But I mean, yeah, I think it's also about gender bias as well.
Thank you. That was very, very well said. Amelia asked, would the movie's characters and setting, would they be different if the movie had been written after 2020?
You'd have to ask Rich Moore and Byron Howard, honestly. I mean, I would hope so, but it's speculative history, I guess. Would it have been different if it had been differently made? Yeah, exactly what it would be like. I would hope they'd be more racially aware, but yeah, I mean, we'd just have to see.
Atticus asked, are there Disney films that do better address systemic racism?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, that's the short answer. And, one of the things about Disney films is, of course, I grew up with them. I watched, The Wonderful World of Disney when I was a child on television in the 1960s. And I remember watching things like all of a sudden Disney was broadcasting color in about 1963 and things like that. I mean, this probably sounds like, I don't know, talking about Model Ts or horse-drawn buggies or something for some of you. But the thing that you realize as an adult looking back over this history of Disney films is they really do have this abysmal record of kind of making fun of racial stereotypes time and time and time again. And, again, Zootopia represents a kind of real advance that I think was consciously made on the part of Disney. And okay, it is a certain kind of advance and maybe a kind of high watermark, but I don't know of other Disney films that do better. I mean, Princess and the Frog is like not nowhere near as good. I think it fails to kind of deal with race very well. And the more recent like live action Disney films, I actually haven't seen those yet. Those might be better, but um, I just don't know because I haven't seen those.
Jake asked, what race do you think Nick is supposed to be?
White. I mean, he's voiced by Jason Bateman, and you get the feeling, I mean, the sense that I get from his backstory that you see as they're going up on the cable car is that, he was a poor white kid. But I mean, I don't see anything that signifies that he's to be taken as anything else. Um, but I mean, that's based on, Jason Bateman, lending his voice to the character, and the way in which I don't see anything um, about Nick as signifying anything other than whiteness, really.
And this looks like our last question. How does the iconic animal cartoon medium play to bias, and what association does it promote with the characters beyond racial and gender association?
Well, I would say, cartoons can be used in all kinds of different ways, right? It depends on, where the artists want to guide them. And, I commend Howard and Moore for trying to make a film that addresses racial bias. I think that's a really great aspiration. Um, the but I mean, as far as like animation and cartoon, I mean, they're going to be like a tool. They can be used in a variety of ways. And in the past, they've been used in quite racist ways, to be quite honest, by Disney. Warner Brothers has done as bad a thing. If you know about the old Warner Brothers cartoons, um, it can also be used in positive ways as well. I mean, the same thing is true of, like live action Hollywood cinema. They can be used in ways that are positive, and they can be used in ways that are quite negative, racially speaking.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Flory. Thank you to all of you for attending tonight. I have posted the attendance link in the chat. Please make sure you go there for credit for this presentation that Dr. Flory was so kind to give. And if you have friends in the Honors College who were not able to make it to this presentation synchronously, we will be posting it on YouTube, and there will be an asynchronous option as long as they click on the link in the description in the YouTube to fill out a form for that on Cats Connect. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Flory, for your time. It was fascinating. I learned a lot, and thank you all for participating.
Okay.
Have a good night.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I'm gonna close out the meetings in a few minutes, so feel free to leave as long as you click on that link before you go. All right. Well, Dr. Flory, good luck with the rest of the semester.
Yeah,
I might
thank
stick
you.
around, but I think you're doing asynchronous, right? So maybe not on campus.
I'm not, unfortunately.
But that's safe. That's safe.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Take care.
I'll probably take one of your classes in the future. So,
Well,
bye.
I'm offering aesthetics and the arts in the spring.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
All right. Well, you know what? Registration is next week. So,
Something to
thank you
think
so
about.
much. Absolutely. Bye,
Bye.
everybody. Thank you. All right. I am ending the meeting. So, click on the link. Okay. 6 of y'all left. I'm assuming you're clicking on the link. I'm going to end it. Bye.
Book. I thought
I love the Jungle Book. I grew up